So today I'm going to try and make English muffins from scratch, which I have never tried before, and I'm going to take you along with me. I found a random recipe from the internet. This one is from thekitchen.com. Doesn't look too bad, but it does have quite a few separate dough rest periods. So I went ahead and made what they're calling a starter last night because they recommend letting it rest for between 1 and 12 hours. And the website says that the longer I let the starter rise, the better texture and flavor the muffins will have. So I went ahead and made the starter last night. And the starter is 3/4 of a cup of flour and half a cup of water and a half a teaspoon of yeast. So I went ahead and made that up last night, and it definitely has begun to bubble and grow. So we'll go ahead and start today with the actual recipe. The instructions say to whisk together the milk, the yeast, and the starter. So we're going to go ahead and get that together. First, we're going to add a cup of milk. It doesn't specify that I need to warm the milk up, so this is straight out of the fridge. We'll see if that was a good idea or not. Milk, yeast, and starter. And I need a teaspoon of yeast. I just used the jarred active yeast. We used to use the packets, and then we found that sometimes our recipes called for a different amount. So we'd end up with a partial packet, and that seemed wasteful. Okay. And then we're supposed to whisk this together. The next step is to add the remaining ingredients. So we'll be adding 2 tablespoons of sugar, two tablespoons of unsalted melted butter. I did let my butter cool down a little so that it's not going to burn or kill the yeast. A teaspoon of salt. And 3 to 3 1/4 cups of flour. We're going to start with 3 and see what we end up with. I'm going to go ahead and get the dough mixing in my mixer with the dough hook on. The instructions from the website told me to knead the dough for 5 to 8 minutes, and it did specify to use the dough hook on a mixer, although it did mention that you could do it by hand. So here we have our dough. We've worked it in the KitchenAid mixer with the dough hook for 5 to 8 minutes. I did about 6.5 or 7. And the next step is to let the dough rise again overnight in the fridge or 1 to 2 hours room temperature. And I think we're going to go with the room temperature setting. So I'm just going to place my dough back into the mixer bowl. I went ahead and lightly greased my bowl so that it doesn't stick. And I'm just going to place that back in there. Put a towel over it and just let it rise at room temperature for 1 to 2 hours. So we're back after our first full dough rise. We let the starter rise for between 1 and 12 hours. I just left it in the fridge overnight. And then the second rise after we made the complete dough was 1 to 2 hours room temperature or in the fridge overnight. And I've gone with about an hour and a half room temperature. So the next step is to go ahead and divide our dough into 12 parts. Go ahead and just get some flour on my counter. My dough out. And we're going to go ahead and divide into 12 parts. The instructions say that we're supposed to roll them into a ball, but the dough is quite dry. So when you try to roll it into a ball, you end up, I don't know if you can see, it doesn't quite incorporate because the dough is fairly dry. So maybe I'm just not rolling enough. I suppose that's better. See, I'm not thrilled with the way that's incorporating, but we're gonna go with that. There is another rise, so maybe when we get that other rise. So I'm doing 6 this way, where I roll it, and then I've done 6 of them in the same way that I shape my biscuits. Where I just sort of start tucking pieces under until I end up with a dome. I just don't like how that's... I don't know that that's going to get any better. Let me show you what I mean about making the dome. So I've taken and I just start tucking pieces under till I end up with a lovely top and all these bits tucked underneath. And when I do my rolls this way, where everything's kind of tucked underneath, it does end up looking pretty nice. And in the rise, it does end up filling in. So I may do the rest like that because these other ones, rolling it into a ball is not working for me. So I think, well, the recipe doesn't state, I think I'm gonna roll it into a ball this way, where I just sort of keep tucking the ends underneath. And end up with a ball that way. We'll see when we have the finished product what we end up with. So we do have a second rise on the dough happening. We're going to let it rise again for another hour at room temperature. We're back now after letting our dough rise for the second time for an hour at room temperature. The recipe for these calls for them to be cooked on the stovetop in a skillet rather than baked. The recipe also directs us to use a muffin ring, but since I don't have any of those, we're going to skip that part. It may mean that our muffins are a little irregular in size, but that's okay. Now that our butter is melted, we're going to go ahead and start placing our muffins into the pan. Just going to do 1 or 2 to start with, these smaller ones. The third one. The recipe calls for us to cook them 5 to 6 minutes per side. It doesn't say how much heat to use, just states that they should be lightly browned on both sides. It does say that if we can't get our heat right and our muffins brown too quickly but aren't cooked all the way through, that we can finish them up in an oven at 350 degrees. So I've gone ahead and preheated our oven just in case. Well, after 3 minutes at medium heat, it looks like I might have my heat too high because the bottoms are browning very quickly. And the recipe calls for 5 to 6 minutes per side. So I'm going to go ahead and flip these, and I suspect very much that I will have to finish them off in the stove. The recipe also stated if I wanted a flatter muffin, I could go ahead and press them down with the spatula at this point. So I think I'm going to try that with this largest one because it's still quite round and doesn't look at all like your standard English muffin. I wonder as well if flattening them out will help make sure that they are cooked all the way through. Leaving them quite tall may make it take quite a bit longer to cook them through. I think I might go ahead and flatten all of these. That's definitely better. We're about 5 minutes in now on the second side. And if we take a look at the bottom here, this is a much better brown than we had from the first side. So it looks like a lower heat is definitely the way to go. I think these are just about done on the bottom side, but because we were cooking them at too high a heat on the top side, I think there's possibility that these may not be cooked all the way through. They are quite thick. So I am going to go ahead and take these out of the pan and put them into the oven to make sure that they are cooked all the way through. And then we'll move on to the second batch. I'm going to go ahead and place my second set right into the pan. I don't know that the butter we put in the first batch was actually necessary. This pan is a really good nonstick. So we're going to go ahead and skip the butter. We may or may not regret this. It doesn't look like my concerns that I had about rolling the dough and having it not stay adhered. It doesn't look like that's going to be an issue. When we have the second rise, any sort of separations in the dough, any sort of sections that didn't look like they were going to stick, did adhere together in the rise. So whether I roll them or tuck them under, I don't think it actually is going to make a difference. I am going to go ahead and flatten these down so that they look a little bit more like a traditional English muffin in size, but also because I think being as thick as they are, it's going to have much greater chance of being not cooked all the way through. While we're waiting for the second batch of biscuits to finish cooking on that second side, I went ahead and pulled the first batch, which I had set in the oven, out, and I'm going to cut one open and see what we've got. I didn't have a way to gauge how long. The recipe doesn't say if you have to finish it in the oven, how long it should be in there. And I think that largely is going to depend on just how undercooked it was. So I'm going to go ahead and cut into one of these and see what we find on the inside. I don't know if you can see this. Here we are on the inside. It does look like it's just cooked through. However, I don't see any nooks and crannies. That's unfortunate. I wonder if it's because we did press the air out. I'm not sure how to fix that. We'll see how we do in the next batch. Well, we're about 6 minutes in on the second side, and I think maybe I turned my stovetop too low because they're barely brown at all on the other side. So I've turned my stovetop back up for the next batch, but I think that these are going to have to go ahead and finish up in the oven. So here we are with the first flip of the last 5 that we've got here. I did turn the heat up back to medium, which is where I had started, and the color here is much better. I think maybe the reason that they got so brown in the first batch was actually the addition of the butter. I did put a little bit of butter in the pan, which the instructions said to do, with the very first batch. However, this is a really great nonstick pan. I love this pan. And so once the initial first buttering went in, I have not added any more butter. So these have gone directly onto the nonstick surface, and they're not nearly as dark on the bottom. And we're back up to full heat. So I think actually if I were to make these in this pan in the future, I wouldn't bother with the butter. I think that that gave us a really dark color after like 3 minutes on this heat versus the same amount of heat. This is 6 minutes. and this is a much better color. So in the future, if I make these, we definitely won't be adding any butter to the pan. Here's a quick overview of the second batch. As you can see, there's still, if you can see that, still not really any nooks or crannies that I was hoping to find. Now this batch also got flattened out with the spatula. In the first batch, here's a sample from the first batch. No nooks and crannies. The first batch I cooked completely on one side, flipped it, and then flattened it out with a spatula. The second batch I went ahead and flattened with the spatula as soon as I put it in the pan, so it was able to continue to rise throughout the whole cook. But it doesn't seem to have made any difference at all. We still have a really dense bake with no nooks, crannies, or air pockets at all. And they are massive. Look how big that is. That's got to be almost 2 inches thick. Just massive. These don't look anything like the traditional English muffin shapes. So there's clearly some work that needs to be done here. I've either misread the recipe or they were just intended to be this large, but I don't think that this is how we want to eat them in our house. So I'm going to have to do a little bit of playing the recipe to get something that's much more like what I would expect to see. So here's the last batch. I went ahead after I finished it on the stovetop and put it into the oven at 350 for about 8 minutes. These ones are still quite large, so I wanted to make sure that they were cooked all the way through. They're just massive. I don't know that I would call that an English muffin. I don't know if that's the recipe or if I've screwed up somewhere. But let's go ahead and cut into one of these. Now these ones I did not press down at all. They hopefully should still have air pockets on the inside. Nope, not a single air pocket. Not sure if you can see that. It is just as dense as the other ones. So it looks like pressing them down to try and flatten them out doesn't actually make a difference. Well, here they are. 12 things. They're not English muffins. If anything, they're more like a dinner roll. They're massive, not at all the size that I would come to expect from an English muffin. And there are no nooks and crannies kind of at all. So while the flavor is good, it's got a very mild, slight sourdough flavor from the fact that we started our starter the day before and gave it a lot of time to really start working. There's just a hint of sourdough, which is about what I would want from an English muffin, but clearly I have gone wrong somewhere in everything else. I'm not sure if it's a matter of my kneading or working of the dough, if it's an issue with the rise, or if it's the recipe itself. This recipe came from thekitchen.com, and in their brief, they did mention that this is a drier dough than you would ordinarily find, but they did find that that worked better for them. I'm not sure it's worked better for me. So I don't think I'm defeated. I definitely think that we will try English muffins again, but I'm going to have to do a little bit of looking first and figure out what went wrong here. These will make perfectly lovely dinner rolls for dinner tonight, and I do think that we will eat them, but we'll probably treat them like a dinner roll rather than a breakfast item. So hopefully I will be able to do a little bit of looking around and see what happened. If any of you have any ideas about quite where I went wrong, or if you've got a tried and true beginner-friendly recipe for English muffins that works great for you every time, I would love to hear about it. This recipe, not the one for us. So thanks for coming along on this cooking adventure, and they can't all be winners. Have a good one.